My name is Richard Lakeman. This is a paper I presented at a local trauma-informed care symposium hosted by the Australian College of Mental Health Nurses and the Queensland branch of the Royal Australian and New Zealand College of Psychiatrists. This paper was presented at the end of the day after much consideration of what trauma-informed care might look like and presentations on addressing cultural change in services. This paper urged participants to bring a systems thinking view to the problem of trauma-informed care. This sophisticated audience will likely understand what is meant by trauma-informed care. That is, it is an approach to healthcare that recognises and responds to the impact of traumatic experiences on individuals' physical, mental and emotional health. It is a framework that aims to create a safe, supportive and empowering environment for people who have experienced trauma. Trauma-informed care involves understanding the prevalence and effects of trauma and how it can affect an individual. This approach recognises the importance of creating a safe and trusting environment and encouraging healthcare providers to be sensitive to the needs and experiences of those who have experienced trauma. The trauma-informed practitioner is concerned about facilitating and enabling access to treatment for trauma. The trauma-informed practitioner is aware that trauma impacts on the neuroception of safety and that any kind of therapy must proceed first by restoring a sense of safety. I expect we can all agree on these principles, and it does sound infinitely sensible. However, is this even possible in the context of the Australian mental health system? To explore this question and what might need to be addressed, I'm going to invite you to take a systemic view of the mental health system. Most of us, most of the time, do not operate or even think in a systemic way. Most of us are trained to consider that manifestations of mental illness arise from some fault or problem within individuals. We are trained to take a linear view of causation. That is, anything that happens within a system is related directly to some previous occurrence within that system. A systemic view invites questions about what is happening in a system, a rich consideration of context and a broad overview of the terrain. Causation is more often viewed as circular. That is, there are sequences of causes and effects that lead back to the original cause and either alter or more often confirm it. Systemic thinkers are interested in these feedback loops which preserve or disrupt the status quo. I also wish to share a couple of systemic concepts to polish our systemic lens. That is the idea of the redundant attempted solution and the idea of first or second order systemic change. However, before we explore what is happening in our mental health system and what happens to people therein, I do want to just explain what I mean by salutogenesis. This speaks to a very big picture question. That is the purpose of the mental health system. Most of us, myself included, give little thought to this, and we do whatever task is asked of us. The current system privileges antiquated models of care, which have not changed for decades. These are medico-centric, risk-obsessed, and increasingly protocol-driven. That is, the computer system dictates how one should do one's work. It relegates most clinicians to being like cogs in a machine. And this would be fine if the output was improved mental health or even effective treatment for so-called serious mental illness. It isn't. The system creates chronicity and blames the patient and their families for being treatment resistant when they don't get better, even though people are not even offered the treatment in most instances. So what is the purpose of a mental health system? Salutogenesis and pathogenesis are two different approaches to understanding health and illness. Pathogenesis focuses on identifying and treating the underlying causes of disease and illness, with a particular emphasis on the biological factors that contribute to disease. In contrast, salutogenesis is an approach that focuses on promoting health and wellness by identifying and strengthening the factors that contribute to health and well-being. The pathogenic approach views health as the absence of disease and sees the body as a machine that can break down and malfunction. This approach focuses on diagnosing and treating specific diseases and conditions using medical interventions such as drugs, surgery, and other medical procedures. The pathogenic approach is reactive. meaning that it aims to identify and treat health problems once they have occurred. Our system emphasises pathogenesis and incentivises a pathogenic view and response to mental health problems. How is this working? I'll leave that somewhat rhetorical question to you to consider. If it was working, anyone with frank impacts of trauma that is manifested in conditions such as PTSD would receive evidence-based treatments in a sufficient dose and in a timely way. That treatment, more often than not, is psychotherapy, for example, EMDR for PTSD, and lifestyle prescription plus talking therapy in the case of high prevalence problems such as mood disorders. I won't belabour the reality that most people do not receive either. I also want to suggest that a more proper focus of mental health services ought to be a salutogenic one. This involves the facilitation of the conditions to achieve wellness, healing and well-being. Indeed, nurse theorists such as Phil Barker have asserted that this is what people need of nurses, nursings and hospital. Healing environments. This is also the language of mental health recovery, another aspirational concept which appears barely reconcilable with mental health practice in Australia. So let's now set aside the aspirations for mental health services and explore the context, which unless one can take a helicopter view or can step outside the daily grind, is very hard to apprehend. I have been lucky enough to have the opportunity to work within Queensland Health before the imposition of SIMA, when notes were still made of paper, when there was no mental health presence in emergency departments, and before the Queensland Mental Health Act of 2000. I then had a roughly 10-year break and returned to an emergency department to find that mental health units were locked and most people accessed mental health services involuntarily. Up to 20 people per day were routinely brought coercively to the emergency department where I worked to be assessed. The acute care team that I worked for, which only a decade before consisted of a half a dozen clinicians, now had in excess of 40 clinicians and a 24-hour presence in the emergency department. The person who smashed this bulletproof glass with a basin had been brought to the emergency department by police against their expressed wishes. The police officers unshackled the person and went to complete their paperwork, and the consumer, in quotes, took exception to being locked in. I can't say I felt particularly safe that day. Coercion begets conflict and containment. There is no sanitising this. Handcuff people, imprison people, restrain them and so on, and the consequences are not generally going to be a neuroception of safety. It is estimated that between 25 to 47% of people exposed to restraint or seclusion develop PTSD subsequent to that experience. Mental health services, of course, must scrupulously account for every incident occasioning the use of restraint and seclusion. But the restraint, seclusion, forced transportation and involuntary sedation of dysregulated people in and en route to the emergency department has become so normalised that it really doesn't raise eyebrows. Most practising health professionals might imagine that it has always been this way. It hasn't. Queensland rapidly went from around 600 people being brought to emergency departments via emergency examination orders in the early 2000s to over 14,000 in 2015. Of course, only a tiny fraction of these people were assessed as needing involuntary treatment. However, by 2015, the expectation that any kind of behavioural disturbance warranted a trip to ED was well entrenched, as was the belief that individuals need to be held involuntarily, essentially locked in and prevented from running away by security guards until assessed. When the shift to emergency examination authorities in the Public Health Act occurred, which loosened the criteria for involuntary assessment to incapacity for any reason, it is likely that rates of coercion have continued to increase since. We don't know because there is no legal requirement for anyone to count the number of EEAs or the number of restraint or seclusion incidents associated with them. It's just such a non-event. However, if we extrapolate this regression line, there would now be in excess of 20,000 presentations per year via this pathway in Queensland. Over 20,000 people start their healthcare journey under coercion in Queensland each year. How is that working? Are people getting the help they need to heal and thrive? This slide I developed for a conference on responding to acute methamphetamine intoxication, a fantasy ideal psychosocial context in which to respond to people. I do want to stress that those that work at the pointy end of things do try their best with the resources they have and in the environment that they find themselves. However, in contrast to this ideal, ED remains far from ideal. The emergency department is one of the most psycho-noxious environments imaginable. Even non-traumatised people are unlikely to experience a neuroception of safety, connection and social engagement in such situations. If they did, something would not be working. Even should a person be assessed as having a treatable mental health problem in this context, the ED is not where people will access treatment. Even if people make it to the ward, which are locked in Queensland, it is most likely that coercion continues. Australia is one of the most coercive nations in the world, with over 55% of all overnight stays in the mental health units being involuntarily. At 227.3 involuntary hospitalisations per 100,000, Australia's rate is 16 times that of Italy, 3.1 times that of New Zealand, and 2.3 times the incidence of Scotland. It is a mere 1.5 times the rate of Finland, but in Finland, the patient's opinion must be taken into account before any treatment can be ordered, and the person is provided with independent court-appointed legal counsel, and so on. As Neeraj Gill and others have pointed out in Queensland, a change to the Mental Health Act in 2016 aimed to protect human rights, paradoxically, led to an increase in involuntary treatment. In systemic thinking, the escalating levels of coercion is an example of a redundant attempted solution. This is the paradox whereby efforts to solve the problem appear to amplify it and to actually make it worse. This is played out regularly in the politics of mental health funding. Dozens of public inquiries into mental health service provision in Australia have repeatedly outlined systemic problems in substandard therapeutic care, yet the response has been to commit record levels of expenditure to do more of what is done already. Australia is breaking a bunch of records, and not all enviable ones. Our spending on mental health is at record levels, and we are help seeking at record levels. That is, doing what we are told and going to a GP. We're the second most medicated country in the OECD, and over 20% of the population is apparently receiving treatment. We're also one of the most depressed countries in the world, despite being treated, and our suicide rates are trending upwards. As over 30 public inquiries over the last 20 years testify, whatever we're doing presently is not working that well. What we repeatedly have here are calls for more staff, more beds, better access sessions, and so on. And of course, mental health services have a lot of form in this area as well, in terms of demanding more resources. Before I show my next slide, I do want to offer a trigger warning. It involves discussion about a person who has died in a mental health unit near here. I won't mention the name of this victim, and I will spare you the graphic footage. The coronial inquest into this woman's death found that she died from a traumatic brain injury caused by numerous falls and the self-beating of her head on various surfaces. The horrific nature of this woman's treatment was revealed in shocking CCTV footage which depicted her neglected, bloodied and covered in feces, wandering the corridors of the facility on the night of her death. The footage exposed a lack of care from staff along with their abject failure to intervene in her untimely death. The State Minister for Health then said that she closed her eyes because the vision was too horrible. And the Federal Minister for Health at that time said that this poor woman was treated in a way that none of us could ever really imagine. The chief psychiatrist of that state said the staff involved failed on every level. There was nothing trauma-informed, recovery-focused, or really anything positive to say about this event. 2 inquiries followed, and one stated the state mental health culture lacked compassion and humanity or real interest in the individual beyond risk management. The system used coercive compliance, had no internal oversight even after the death, lacked guidelines, had little evidence of engagement with consumers and carers, little involvement in care planning, and had no examples of the necessary leadership required to give high quality compassionate care. The Justice Action Group commented, "The response to the exposed disgrace further highlighted the uncaring system. None of the leading organisations nor the health department addressed this person's death and prevention of such deaths in the future in their presentations. In the inquiries that followed, none of the recommendations would have made any difference to changing the culture, as none of them gave any more respect or power to consumers. They all wanted to benefit from her death and demand more resources for themselves." This is a further example of a redundant attempted solution. Every inquiry at almost every turn has recommended more beds, more resources, more cameras, more staff. The recent parliamentary inquiry into the opportunities to improve mental health outcomes for Queenslanders is almost archetypal in this respect, leading in its recommendations for more money for mental health, alcohol and other drug services. Despite numerous submissions made with respect to the locked door policy in Queensland, the only time that locked was mentioned was in a quote stating that carers continue to tell us they feel marginalised, disregarded or locked out of the decision-making process. The word coercion is not mentioned at all, and in the entire report the word involuntary is used 3 times and states that the Mental Health Act focuses on individual rights, and any limitation on rights, for example involuntary treatment, is subjected to strict legislative criteria, intended to ensure that the limitation is necessary and the least restrictive in these specific circumstances. There is nothing to see here, no coercion, no mention at all of the coercive processes that might precede the least restrictive involuntary treatment, except by way of a quote from the Mental Health Commission alluding to emergency departments becoming unintentionally the main access point to mental health services. Trauma is mentioned more frequently with quotes such as, "The trauma I experienced was worse than that of my suicide attempt." In relation to trauma-informed care, the Royal Commission into Victoria's mental health system, which exhorts that the system needs to provide more holistic approach for consumers and must be responsive to trauma and the potential for consumers to be re-traumatised. The recommendations for some alternatives to ED and co-design of services is not a systemic response, and neither is the blue sky thinking whole of government response to trauma or recommendations for person-centred care. Our system is not person-centred, it is clinician-centred, or more particularly medico-centric. I don't think Queensland Health, nor the Productivity Commission for that matter, demonstrate any understanding about what person-centred care is. The provision of specialist support and broadly what is done already in emergency departments. A systemic problem requires a systemic solution. Our system is dangerous. There is an urgent need to restore a sense of safety to service users from the get-go. Now, we trauma-informed clinicians know, or at least now understand, the idea of the window of tolerance. We understand that neuroception precedes conscious appraisal of one's situation, and that the experience of trauma can lead to people being triggered into sympathetic fight or flight or dorso-vagal shutdown. If more often than not our processes to access care and support trigger a neuroception of fight or flight, then this is ipso facto not a trauma-informed process. Attempting to solve this problem for an individual, or even making the passage for a small percentage of service users less traumatic, is absolutely a good thing. However, in systems thinking, or family systems thinking, this is what is known as a first-order change, a temporary shift in systemic dynamics that can set the stage for more sustainable second-order changes. A second-order change entails the fundamental rewriting of a system's underlying rules. Presently, these underlying rules, the way things really work in practice, are not even acknowledged. Here are some of my first principles for first-order change. These really apply to any team and any service user. This is when applied to an individual relationship and how we might best facilitate better outcomes for individuals. But it doesn't really lead us to rewrite the fundamental rules of the system, any more than including some consumers in picking the colour scheme of the psychiatric intensive care unit reduces coercion. For me, these principles can be reduced to an emergency department aphorism: let them eat sandwiches. When I worked in the emergency department, hospital sandwiches lubricated many a productive encounter that didn't start out well. We need to address the person's most basic needs and then consider what does this person need right now and what do they need to address their broader problem, not just the symptoms or their presenting problem. All trauma treatment is or ought to be phase-based, addressing basic needs, stabilisation, or equipping people with the resources to tolerate distress and building alliances. The first step and prerequisite to being psychotherapeutic is to ensure that people's physiological and safety needs are met. Stabilisation of basic needs must occur first. My belated epiphany around this came when I was facilitating a DBT program, and we felt an enormous pressure and internal pull to accept a homeless young person into the program because it was the only evidence-based program going. We should have slowed down, facilitated basic needs first, and achieved some kind of stabilisation before rushing in and expecting a young person with no home to engage enthusiastically in a program when they had no safe place to sleep. Indeed, slowing down, resourcing and equipping people is what is supposed to happen in DBT programs and other forms of psychotherapy such as EMDR. But well-meaning psychotherapists often want to rush people into that stage of therapy where they believe change occurs. Rush them into, say, attending skills group or processing traumatic memories. Another aphorism, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Here are some general principles on the provision of safe trauma therapy from Babette Rothschild. This moves beyond merely providing trauma-informed care and onto the proper treatment of those with trauma. Rothschild emphasises restoring or establishing a sense of safety first, stabilisation, then resourcing, and truly person-centred or needs-adapted care. Surely a trauma-informed system would value and provide evidence-based treatments for trauma. However, if psychotherapy is the treatment, then it is my view that it is really often offered in our system. How many services routinely provide the right treatment and the right support at the right time and the right amount by the right people? That's a rhetorical question. I think very few services. In terms of providing more resources, however, that first order change that people often require, from this point of view, that might relieve some of the steam or the pressure in the pressure cooker. So there's no question that might be a good thing, but it won't lead to second order change. My hope for this presentation is that it has prompted you to consider what fundamental and systemic changes might assist in shifting the system from an almost exclusively pathogenic focus to one that supports salutogenesis. That is the promotion of the right conditions for healing and recovery. I introduced you to a couple of systemic concepts to assist in considering what might need to change to nudge the system in the right direction. Firstly, the idea of the redundant attempted solution, the paradox whereby efforts to solve the problem appear to amplify the problem and make it worse. What does our system enable that is unhelpful, traumatogenic, and actually makes things worse? In response to a public inquiry, do we really just need more resources, more of the same? Secondly, the idea of first and second order change. To understand this concept, we need to understand that there are implicit rules or ways that a system operates. Rarely do our public inquiries shed light on these rules. And often, immersed as we are in doing what we do, clinicians have little awareness of these rules either. Being a trauma-informed clinician can be a source of great moral distress and discomfort. The awareness that our system is highly coercive, medico and pharmacocentric, and by and large doesn't work for many people, if not most, can be very painful. You, of course, can be an effective trauma-informed clinician or individual and meet everyone with an emphasis on restoring and maintaining safety, addressing basic needs, stabilisation, and the facilitation to the right treatment by the right team or person in the right dose at the right time. This would be commendable. We can all be highly competent first-order system change agents. However, I do urge you to consider what systemic changes might lead to sustained second order change, a change to the rules underpinning the system. Thank you for sticking with me till the end. I now invite comments or your consideration on how second order change can be achieved, how we might truly create a trauma-informed system.